So this is the first one's going to be an overview for survey methodology. In the coming weeks, we're going to go into more detail on a few more specific type topics, but this one's a quick overview. So the first thing that I introduce the students to is this concept of we have survey data, we use survey data, we use administrative data, and we can use a combination of the two. So I like to get into this right away. So what is survey data? What is administrative data? How can they work together? So I'm pulling the ultimate faux pas of being an instructor or a teacher, and I'm asking a question on the first slide. Does anyone out there want to try, maybe they can do this in the chat, does anybody want to try and tell me if they know what the difference between data and information is, and if they want to give this answer in front of all these other countries that are represented? I see no one typing, and this isn't surprising. It's early on in the presentation. We're going to have a quiz later in the presentation that I hope people answer, but that one will be multiple choice. So the difference between data and information is data tends to be, we think of it as a data point. So it could be a survey respondent, it could be a business, it could be what someone has done on a certain day, and we record many days of it. Whereas information is the sum of this stuff. So it's when we process it down to a statistic, if you will. Now, I inherited this presentation in 2007, and I had to take it from overhead, like the overhead machines, to put it into PowerPoint. And I was going to remove this slide because what is a survey? Everyone who works at Statistics Canada, hopefully, and everyone who works in statistical offices understands what a survey is. But why I left this one in is the part that I've bolded at the end. And what's really important is the fact that we're taking this data and we're going to compile it into a summary form, which will then give information to the end user. So for us, the end user might be a different government department. It may be universities. It could be any sort of data user or information user for Statistics Canada. So this is what we concern ourselves with, is obviously the collection of information, how we're going to do it, but also how are we going to present it in such a way that the users can use the data effectively. The anecdotal story I like to give to my students is, imagine if we went out and did, say, door-to-door collection for, let's say, a city in Canada, and we did paper questionnaires, and we collected, 2,000 questionnaires back, and then we showed up at the client's door. Let's say it's a health unit or something, a municipal government. We said, here's your 2,000 questionnaires, enjoy. They'll be very excited for about 5 minutes, flipping through the questionnaires. But after about 5 minutes, they're going to ask us, what do we do with this data, right? It's up to us to help them to learn how to use the data and make it into information. All right. So there's at least two different types of information. I find that a lot of my presentations, they dichotomize, they split things into two. So two different ways to look at information is you can have descriptive statistics. So it's just explaining what happens. So the example I have here is, what is the prevalence of stroke in Canada in 2020? And I would say that nearly all of Statistics Canada's statistics that we publish can be described as descriptive. Now, analytic, this is where we're testing a statistical hypothesis or exploring a relationship amongst characteristics. We have at Statistics Canada, we have in-house analysts that will write papers, but the papers they write will, they're published through the same channel as the survey results, but they're in a much different format. So there's nothing that will confuse the user between what is descriptive statistics that we're publishing, such as gross tonnage of a certain product, and an analyst who's written a report saying, the housing market in Canada may be changing because of this. It's not very common for us to write papers that are on the analytics side, but it does happen. Okay, so why do we do this? And again, this is something that when you're inside a statistical agency, we say to ourselves, well, it's obvious, right? We do surveys because that's my job. And without surveys, I would have no job, and that's why we do them. But we do surveys when there's a need for information. And I use this to remind my students that we don't ever want to ask questions that aren't relevant to the topic at hand. So we want to make sure to make this as succinct as possible. And we also have to be able to justify to our data providers, whether it be someone filling out a questionnaire or a business, why is it that we're seeking this information from them? If we can't justify why we're collecting the information, then we probably shouldn't be collecting it. So it's just always something we have to keep in the back of our mind, that we do these surveys because there's this need for information, and that's really what's driving the entire process. What kinds of surveys can we have? So census or a sample survey. So when we talk about a census, we talk about collecting information from all of the units in the population. A lot of people sort of say, well, a census isn't a survey. It is. It's just a survey with 100% coverage. At Statistics Canada, we have two major censuses, the Census of Agriculture and the Census of Population. So the Census of Agriculture is a census of all farms in Canada that there's a criteria. I think they have to produce at least $1,000 worth of crops or something. So if you own a farm that produces less than $1,000 worth of crops, you're not in the Census of Agriculture, I believe. Otherwise you are. So we have every single farming type is in our Census of Agriculture. And we also have our Census of Population. For our Census of Population, we have a short form, which goes to every single household. And we also have a longer form, which goes to a subsample of our population for them to fill out a much more detailed survey. Statistics Canada has an incredible number of surveys. Many countries find it astonishing, I think might be a good word, how many surveys we actually have. So Statistics Canada has over 300 active surveys going on at any time, and we publish every day. So our data release to the public is called the Daily. It's published every morning at 8:30.00, and there's actual computer algorithms in place to make sure that the data comes out at 8:30.00. And there was once a data release that came out, I think it was 15 seconds or 45 seconds early, and we actually received complaints about this because of the effect that it had on people who were using business data to buy stocks and bonds and to see how the markets were going. So we were very careful about how we release our data. Our labor force survey is sort of our bread and butter survey. I think everyone at Statistics Canada sort of puts an emphasis on the work that they do. I worked on labor force survey, therefore it's an important survey. We sample about 60,000 households a month to do our labor force survey, but there's all sorts of different surveys. And basically anything that creates revenue is measured on the business side. So when we look at administrative data, this is information that's collected by organizations and departments for their own purposes. Canada has a very, very, very strong Statistics Act. We have the right to collect any information, any data that any business has. We tend to not use the carrying a big stick approach. We tend to use the soft glove approach in negotiating with data providers. We like to encourage them by telling them, why the data is important, how it'll be useful for them. So businesses obviously like to use our data about the business sector they're in. They know that if they don't provide the data, then the data they're going to get it back is meaningless. So that encourages people. But we get a lot of different data from organizations and departments. But the problem, or one of the difficulties with administrative data, is they collect it for their own purposes. And so it obviously, it's not always in the best format for us as Statistics Canada, and sometimes it needs a lot of working for us to be able to use it properly. Sources of administrative data. So here's some examples, like vital statistics, birth and deaths. Health, we have hospital admissions. So in Canada, we have 10 provinces and 3 territories. The health is at the provincial level, so the federal government is not responsible for health. We have to enter into agreements with each of the 10 provinces and the 3 territories. Education, same thing. This is the provincial level, and so is justice. So we have this interesting relationship where the federal government needs to negotiate with the provincial governments how the data is going to be collected and what we're going to do with it. All right, what can we use administrative data for? So obviously we can use it, if we look down at the very bottom, we can use it for direct tabulation. So we can use this to say, here's administrative data. One of the things we have in Canada is called a cancer registry. So we have a list for every province, every incidence of cancer. So the cancer registry we can use for direct tabulation. We know every incidence of cancer. It's sent from every province to us, the Statistics Canada. We can publish that without doing much work to it. But there's other things you can use administrative records for. So creation, maintenance of survey frames, construction of our sample design, anything in this list. Survey evaluation. So sometimes what we can do is we can say, the administrative data available to us isn't exactly what we're looking for. We'll go and we'll do our survey, but then we'll check at the end and we'll see, is the result that we're getting approximately close to what that other administrative data source was getting? And if it's not, we'll either question what we've done or we'll look into see what their methodologies are to see why there's a difference in what we're getting and what they're getting. So there's lots of different uses for administrative data. When we compare them, a census to a sample survey to administrative data, census obviously are very expensive. There's long delays before it's released. There's heavy response burden. Sample survey, it's less costly. We can do this quite a little bit quicker. What's interesting, and a lot of people don't think of it, is that the small size allows for tighter quality control, and hence you can sometimes get more accurate data by doing sample surveys than you can by a census. As all of us are probably aware, when you send out interviewers to the entire country to do interviews, you're going to get, there's quite a few mistakes that are going to happen. And unless you have a lot of time to process the data, some of these mistakes will get through. Administrative data, it's very inexpensive. We can do small area estimation if we have it. On the disadvantage side, which is important, the definitions, concepts, and the target population may be different. And this is what's critically important when we're looking for administrative data. What is the source? How did they create it? What's it being used for? So we always have to be conscious of administrative data isn't the end all be all of perfection for us. Sometimes it's just unavoidable that we'll have to do sample surveys, or for larger projects, we may have to do a census. We can also talk about the idea of the difference between a cross-sectional and a longitudinal survey. So a cross-sectional survey means that it's done once, or it may be repeated in the future, but we're using a different sample each time. So a different group of people are going to be selected to answer the survey. So the sample represents the population at each of these surveys, or each of these iterations of the survey. So we go out, we want to do a survey, we collect whatever number of people we're going to interview, maybe 100, maybe 1,000. We interview them and we publish the results. And then maybe the next year we're going to go out and do the same thing, but it's with a different population. Whereas with longitudinal surveys, you're now using exactly the same respondents and you're using them over time. So for us in the labor force survey, if someone is selected for labor force survey, they're in for 6 months, and we will contact them once a month for 6 months. We'll ask them a lot of the same questions. The first interview is much longer, but we'll follow up with them every month for 6 months to see if there's been a change in their labor force status and such things like that. In the United States, they do it slightly differently. If you're selected, you're in for a year, but they only contact you every 2 months. So you're still interviewed 6 times, but it's over a different time period. And longitudinal surveys can be done for incredibly long periods of time. I've read studies in the US where they've followed entire towns, from the 1950s forward, and they're still collecting this data, and they're looking for health effects of different employment types. So there's a longitudinal survey of nurses. They will follow nurses through their entire career and into retirement to see what the effect of being a nurse was on their overall health. All right. So what do we have to consider? One of the first things we have to consider is we have to consider the survey objectives. We have to look at our conceptual definitions, obviously our operational constraints, and our data requirements. So I'm going to go over these quickly over the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes. Here's a wonderful example of getting your conceptual definitions wrong. So this was, I found this on the internet. This was listed as a crunchy vegetable salad. This is the kind of salad I can really get behind eating daily. So we always have to be careful when we're looking at our conceptual definitions to make sure everyone's on the same page. So I'm going to go through a couple of quick examples of surveys we do at Statistics Canada. So one of them is the youth smoking survey. And the survey objective here is to provide information on smoking behavior of students in grade 5 to 9. So in Canada, that's ages about 10 to 14. And they want to measure the change that occur over time. So this isn't a longitudinal survey in the sense that they won't ask the same students, but it's a cross-sectional survey that they'll do over and over again. Now, the slides are available beforehand, so some of you may have gone through and maybe have seen this, but I normally put my students on the spot. I'm not going to do this to any of you, but the question becomes, you answered this survey, 70 of you, but the question becomes, what do these actually mean? What does it mean to currently smoke? What does it mean to formerly smoke? And what does it mean to have never have smoked? And when I do this in the classroom, and I don't mind putting my students on the spot, none of them initially put their hands up. No one wants to try to tackle this question. And it's strange because Individually, we all have a fairly good idea of which one we fit into, or at least how we self-define ourselves in this currently smoked, formerly smoked, or never smoked. And I don't know, I enjoy this. It unfortunately breaks trust with my students because they think it's mean of me to do it to them, but I eventually regain their trust, I think. So let's take a look at this. And it's tricky. And so currently smoked, so you've smoked at least 100 cigarettes in your lifetime, and you've smoked in the past 30 days preceding the survey. Formerly smoked, you've smoked at least 100 cigarettes and you haven't smoked in the past 30 days. And never smoked is you've smoked fewer than 100 cigarettes in your lifetime. Now, a couple things I want to talk about this is, where do we get these definitions? So I always tell the Statistics Canada employees, I say, as much as you can, be lazy in the work that you do. And I don't mean be lazy as in be unprofessional. I mean, don't try to do work that doesn't belong to you. And when we want to do a survey on smoking, it's never up to us within Statistics Canada to define what smoking is. Our client for this will almost invariably be Health Canada, which is the federal health part. And so we'll ask them, what is your definition of smoking? And so they'll provide this to us. And hopefully Health Canada's gotten this from the United Nations or the World Health Organization so that we have international comparability. Because if we stuck a bunch of Statistics Canada employees in a room and said, let's define what these three concepts are, and we get it wrong, it means that the survey results will be garbage and we'll have to throw it out. So if, for example, if we had said never smoked means someone has never smoked a cigarette in their life, we will have a much different conceptual definition than most other, in this example, countries in the world. And our data will become uncomparable and in fact useless. Now, there are ways around this. So let's say we understood that there was going to be a consumption requirement, so a certain number of cigarettes, and there was going to be a time consumption, a certain period of time. We could ask the respondent, estimate how many cigarettes you've smoked in your life, and we could put an upper limit, like if it's more than 250, you can just say more than 250, because for lifelong smokers, I wouldn't want them to have to estimate the number of cigarettes they smoke. And we can also quite easily ask them, when was the last time you had a cigarette? And they should know if it was in the past 30 days or not. So if we accidentally got this wrong and we said maybe in the past 2 weeks, we can then change it so that if we ask them when the last time they smoked was, we can change this definition as we need to. So if you get the conceptual definitions of your survey wrong, it can almost be unrecoverable, and it's done. Your survey is over. There's nothing you can do. Now, for the survey, what operational constraints do we have? We needed to stay in relatively densely populated areas. So Canada is I can't stress how big a country it is. In the north, the population density is 1 person per 10 square kilometers. So we do our surveys in mostly densely populated areas if we're doing it in person, which this one is. We don't need to survey the entire class, but it's easier if you're going into a classroom and say they're filling out a paper questionnaire. We can pass the questionnaires around to the students quite quickly and they come back to us. We'll need parental consent in Canada to do this survey. We also have to explain to parents that they don't get to see the results of this, which is sometimes difficult, because if the students understand that the parents are going to see the results, the smoking rate of children in Canada quickly approaches 0, as none of them will admit to it. So what are they looking for? So we also have to know what are the data requirements for the survey before we go ahead and design it. So prevalence of smoking is number 1. And if we were designing a really quick survey, that might be it. That's it. We're stopping. But they wanted to know other things. So they want to know what smoking behaviors are, social and demographic factors associated with smoking, where they're obtaining cigarettes. So this is a big issue in Canada. Are they able to buy them from the store? Are they stealing them from their parents, or are they buying them illegally from other children or adults? Recollection of opinions on health warning messages. So we put sort of those ugly messaging on our tobacco and our cigarette packs. If the children can't recall the messaging or on media, then the message isn't working. They have to change things. And then we also ask some experience with alcohol, drugs, and medication for non-medical purposes, because it fits in with smoking. So this goes back to that earlier slide where I said we need to only ask questions when it's relevant. This kind of stuff, unfortunately, can be relevant at the same time. Longitudinal immigrants have surveyed to Canada. So here, this is to study how new immigrants adjust to life in Canada over time. And this is a longitudinal survey, so we'll follow them for a few years, I think it is. Now, we get into issues with conceptual definitions here, like what is integration? So it's the process through which newcomers participate in and shape the Canadian community. What does this mean? Unfortunately, for a lot of our conceptual definitions, they're going to have sub-definitions under them. Luckily, because I'm on the statistics side as a methodologist, this doesn't fall into my job description. This will be left to what we call subject matter experts. And I'm glad it falls to them because I'm much more happy to stick with the numbers. The operational constraints. So we'll have large selected groups of people that can't complete the questionnaire in English and French. If we put the condition on this that the respondent, the immigrant, had to answer in English or French, we would lose anyone who isn't able to speak English or French, and this would give us an incredibly biased result. It would make participation in Canadian community look much stronger because the person's able to communicate in one of our two official languages, and so that'd be very concerning to us. We really need to know what's happening with recent immigrants who don't speak either English or French, because they're the ones we have to be most concerned for, I think. Time and cost is always a constraint. I tell my students, if you get into a survey where time and cost is not a consideration, please call me. I would love to work on it. What are we looking for? So again, data requirements. We need to hammer this out with the clients before we start our survey. So they're looking for language proficiency, housing, education. In Canada, we have issues with foreign credential recognition. So a lot of universities around the world may not be recognized by Canadian institutions as being, the degree may not be recognized at the same level. So we have issues there sometimes. Employment health, values and attitudes, development and use of social networks. They don't mean this isn't Facebook and Twitter and that. They mean actual community networks, and income and perceptions of settlement in Canada. So that's the end of the first half. This is much more prepping before the survey, especially when we're looking for what are our conceptual definitions and what are our data needs. So if we need to start there before we get into hammering away at the statistical side. How are we going to do this? This is where we have to know this stuff beforehand. All right, let's look at the second half. So here we go. So sample plan. The sample plan consists of 3 different components. So the sample design, which I'm going to talk about, but our sample design always has to take into account the estimation procedures and the estimates of precision. So what is it that we're trying to calculate? And how are we going to do it? And what are we going to release? So are we releasing tabular data? Are we releasing micro data sets? What exactly is it that we're trying to produce? And we also have to think, what kind of estimates of precision are we going to give? Or how precise do these estimates have to be? So for us, for example, our unemployment rate, they need it to 0.1%. And that's very important. Whereas for some of our other surveys, the level of precision can be much less because they just don't need it to be that precise. All right, so what does our sample design consist of? There's at least 6 parts, but there's 6 parts I'm going to talk about. So the population of interest, that's very important to us. The frame, and I'm going to go through all of these in time, so I'm just going to quickly say them here. Our survey units, our sample size, stratification and sample allocation. Stratification and sample allocation is so important. It's getting its own presentation later on in the series. And I'll talk about that. And then sample selection methods. I'm going to talk briefly about that today, but again, that's going to get its own that'll get us, in fact, that'll be in many of the presentations coming up after this week. All right, so what about our population? So the population that we're looking for is the units about which the information is being sought. So who is it that we need to talk to? Sometimes this is perfectly clear. So for example, if you're looking at a national estimate of employment, you might be looking at everyone who lives in the country. Or it could be everyone who's in the country that day. So some countries' censuses look for people who live in a certain place, and some censuses look at who's in that country at that date. So there's slight differences. You need to know the defining characteristics of the unit. This is especially important on the business side, location of the units, and the time period under consideration. And we'll go through some examples now, or in a couple minutes.
Sorry, Gavin, there is a question in the chat. It's just asking, why does Canada conduct a long and short form census, and who receives the long form? I don't know.
Okay. The long form census is received by, it used to be 1 in 5 households, and I think it might be 1 in 3 households now. Tracy, does that sound right? I think it's 1 in 3 households. So it's definitely random. They randomly assign who gets the long form census. The long form census requires a lot more data, so they try not to burden every household with it, and they're able to produce estimates with it. So constitutionally, we're required to do a census. And in fact, one of the provinces that joined Confederation in Canada part of their agreement to join was that we would conduct a census of their population every 5 years. And so that's why we do a census every 5 years. What's interesting is that province is also the least government-friendly province probably in the country, and their population hates it when we ask them questions. So it's kind of a funny conundrum that we're in. But yeah, so we're required by law to do a census population, and then the long form is just added on to collect, to give a much broader picture of what the Canadian perspective of population is. I see another question here. Conceptual definition related to conceptual framework. I don't know how those two interrelate. Conceptual definition is really about the variables of the data that you're trying to collect, whereas the framework is probably more about the way that you structure the way you create your survey. So I don't really have a good answer for that. I'm sorry. All right, so target population. The target population is the population we would love to talk to or we'd like to collect information for. And the survey population is the population that's actually going to be covered by the survey. And there's lots of reasons why these two populations may be different. Ideally, here's a little picture of it. Ideally, we have 100% coverage. So the yellow is the survey population, and the blue is the target population. So in this first one, we have like a total eclipse that everyone who's eligible can be selected, and there. It's much more typical. In fact, it's expected, I would say, that there's going to be this blue part of your population that you would like to collect information from that you're just not going to be able to. So an example of this that's very quick that I can use is if we want to talk to citizens of the city of Ottawa, where I live, we have a jail in our city. We have long-term housing. We have a lot of different institutionalized people. For something like labor force survey, we wouldn't want to talk to them. So they're excluded. So when we talk about what's the population rate in the city of Ottawa, we have this general idea of everyone in the city, but the people that we're actually going to talk to is a smaller subset. It also excludes children, for example. So we would say our target population would be adults living in the city of Ottawa. This third one, this one's horrible. So the sort of the crescent moon that's outside of our population, these are called out of scope. And these are ones that have accidentally gotten into our survey that shouldn't be there. And this is horribly bad for us. It's very typical to have some out of scopes, but the more out of scope units you have, the much worse off your project's going to be. And we work really hard to avoid having out of scope units in our surveys. We tend to have in Statistics Canada a few introductory questions. I'm sure all of you probably do this, where we'll ask them just to make sure they fit into the target population of a survey. So a typical population for a survey may be all persons 18 years of age and older living in private dwellings in Ontario. So Ontario is one of our provinces during the survey week. So the time period is very clear to us. We're conducting a survey from March 15th to March 20th. As long as they're living in a private dwelling during that time, they're eligible. We do have an issue where sometimes children, young adults, they'll turn 18 during the survey week. So let's say their birthday is tomorrow, St. Patrick's Day. They were ineligible for the first 2 days, but they're eligible for the last 3 days. And we actually want to avoid this because we don't want people turning eligible during our survey. So we will say they must have been at least 18 years of age or older on the 15th of March. Definition of private dwellings. For us, it means you must be able to live in it all year long. That's a big deal in Canada because of winter. And it must have access to running water and electricity. And it must have no other, people can't be walking through your living space to get to their living space. So that's a definition of that's a very loose definition of private dwelling in Canada. On the business side, so all retail stores selling sporting goods in Ottawa from May to August of 2020. So here we have a very well-defined time period, so May to August. Ottawa is the city I live in, that Tracy lives in. The geopolitical boundaries of Ottawa changed in the year 2000 or roughly around there, and it swallowed up a bunch of smaller cities that were around it. And so the smaller the geographical area, the more likely you're going to have a hard time defining it. So for example, every one of us should be able to define the boundaries of our country, for example. But if you get into something smaller like parishes, I think a lot of countries may have those, the parish boundaries may be more difficult. And if we go even lower than that into neighborhoods, neighborhoods are going to have sort of very loose definitions, and it'll be very hard for interviewers it may be very difficult for interviewers to figure out neighborhood boundaries, and they may be changing all the time. So if we have a geographical component, the larger the geography, usually the more stable it is, and the smaller the geography, the more fluctuation there is. Now, I give this as an example to my students because this one can be really tricky. And if a client comes to us and say they want to talk about all retail stores selling sporting goods, the question has to be asked, do they mean exclusively sporting goods? Do they mean 50% of their sales are in sporting goods, or do they mean they sell sporting goods? So for us, Walmart would have the largest revenue of a retail store selling sporting goods, but Walmart obviously doesn't exclusively sell sporting goods. So if we don't clarify this with the client ahead of time, the population that we may be looking at might be different. So they may be looking at what is the effect of COVID lockdown on sporting goods stores that exclusively sell sporting goods. If we include Walmart in that, for example, it's going to absolutely destroy the results. And so we have to know ahead of time what our population is. And we don't want to be disturbing the large retailers such as Walmart if the survey is really meant to only cater to sporting goods stores. So this is very important for us to know ahead of time. All persons graduating from university in Canada in June 2020. So the one that I usually get my students to pick up on here is, what does it mean to graduate in June 2020? The tighter the time frame, the more obscure this concept gets. All of us, if you've gone to college or university that's on this this presentation, you should hopefully be able to say what year you graduated from college or university. If I ask you to tell me what day you graduated from college or university, most of us may have a really difficult time doing that. Personally, I don't know what the definition of my graduation date is. And I say this to my students. We have a long discussion about this. Is it the day that you actually walk up on stage and receive your certificate? Or is it when the administrative file from my university is sent to some central processing office at the Ministry of Education? As upsettingly boring as that sounds, that may be the legal definition of when I've graduated, is when this administrative file moves from one entity to the other. So if a client came to me and said, I need to know people that graduated in June 2020, I would probably ask them if they meant people that graduated in the school year, starting fall 2019 and ending in June 2020. So that school year for us. Are they looking for exclusively Canadians, or are foreign students allowed to answer this? If they're looking for foreign students, they're going to have a very difficult time following up. They would have to, in this case, have administrative data files from the universities to be able to know who graduated June 2020 and what their contact information is. And there may be international difficulties in interviewing people outside of Canada for a Statistics Canada survey. I'm not too aware of that. So there's all sorts of, it seems fairly obvious. We want to talk to all of our university graduates from last year or from June 2020, but what does this mean? And we really, again, have to nail this down when we're doing our survey. All trips taken by Canadians to destinations overseas from Canada in the fourth quarter of 2020. Again, the time period here is very well defined, fourth quarter from Canada. So they have to have departed from Canada. Trips. So do they mean recreational? Who is the sponsor of this? Do they mean recreational trips? Does it include business trips? Does it include someone who is, for example, maybe you're a courier. You're taking something from Canada, delivering it somewhere overseas, and then flying back. Is this considered to be a trip? So this is something that we have to define very carefully. This is another one that I like to sort of put to my students. I ask them what the definition of overseas is. And if someone came to me and said they went on a holiday overseas, in my mind, I wouldn't question what they meant. I would understand they meant they flew somewhere over the ocean. It's probably a lot trickier in the Caribbean, obviously. But Canada's got a very bizarre definition of what overseas is. And the definition of overseas in Canada is anywhere other than Canada or the United States. So if we have someone drive from Canada down through Mexico, down through Central America, and drive down to South America, they've technically driven overseas. And this sounds like a bizarre definition. Overseas was just sort of an easy word to use that didn't mean Canada or the US. And it's horrible as a word of choice, but it makes sense when you look at the construct of the Canadian economy. we're right beside the United States. 90-something% of our trips are probably taken in the United States. 90% of our country trade probably happens with them. So it's just an easier way for us to say somewhere other than Canada and the United States. All right. So once we've defined this concept of what our population is, we know who it is that we're trying to target. We may now need a frame. So surveys fall into two different categories. So there's frame dependent, which you need a frame, or there's frame independent surveys. A frame independent survey is an example where if you give someone a clipboard, you ask them to walk around and ask people questions, they don't need to know the population they're drawing from. They just have to see someone in front of them and ask them the questions. A frame dependent survey means you need to make sure that every element of your population has a chance of being selected and you know where they are and how to contact them. So a frame is just a list that covers the units of the survey population. So it could be all businesses making more than $1,000, all car companies making more than 100 cars a year. It's some sort of way to find this list. And for a frame to be good, you need to also have effective means of accessing the units. So phone numbers, addresses, something like this. If I had the list of all the names in this presentation, but I didn't know what country you worked for example, my frame wouldn't be very good because I would have no idea how to contact or follow up with people. So there's a few different types of frames. There's list frames and area frames. So a list frame is a physical or conceptual list of elements. So for people my age or older, we remember the phone book with just lists and lists and lists of phone numbers. For my younger students, this seems like a horrible violation of privacy. The idea that their name and phone number and address were published in a book that got delivered to everyone. So times are changing, but everyone should have an idea of what a list frame looks like. An area frame is more of a geographical area. So what we can do is we can drill down and drill up. So from Canada, we can go down to the 10 provinces and 3 territories, but we can drill down further. And for us, we can drill all the way down to a block face. So we can have a city block and we can say, okay, on the north facing, the north face of that block, we're going to select a dwelling. And you can have multiple frames. You can have all sorts of combinations of the two together, and they may overlap. And so one of the things we have to be concerned about is what is the impact of the frame that we're using? So the actual frame that we're using is directly going to affect the definition of our survey population. So the only people that we're going to be able to contact if we're using a frame-dependent sampling method is someone who's on this list. If they're not on the list, they're not being contacted. So for example, a difficulty for us is our homeless population. If we're trying to do a survey of homeless people, we don't have a list. We don't have a frame. If we're looking for people living in houses or any kind of dwelling apartments, we can then use an area frame. And with this area frame, we can say, okay, everyone who lives in a privately occupied dwelling in this geographical boundary is eligible. And then we can go and pick, 10 Main Street, 2 Oak Street. Those are our 2 selected dwellings. We're going to go talk to the people who live there. With homelessness, it's much more difficult and it requires a much more intricate sampling method to be able to do it. The method of data collection. So if I have email addresses for the people here, or I have phone numbers, it's going to change the way in which I can collect the data. And it will affect the sample selection method. The more information I have on the frame, the more I can use this information to change the way that I'm going to do my selection. And we'll see that in a few presentations in the future. All right, some of the essential qualities. So we want them to have some way to identify the unit and locate them. And we want it to obviously be a complete listing. The desirable qualities is that they're up to date. And we also want it to be arranged in a suitable manner for sampling. Once you have an electronic copy of a frame, it's usually fairly easy to turn it into a suitable method for sampling. Now, frame defects, presence of foreign elements, duplication, missing elements, misclassification, and overcoverage. I have, boring statistician life. I always love when I get to this line that says presence of foreign elements because it sounds like I have spies or something in my data set. Unfortunately, it's not. It means that I have something like, I have a list of all the privately occupied dwellings. One of these households has been converted. So someone has taken a household and they've converted it into a law office, or there's many different ways that private residences get converted into businesses in Canada. So it may be an echo, a person living at 10 Main Street, it was a house for a long time. They've converted it into a business. It hasn't trickled down the pipe yet for us to know that, we accidentally select, I mean, it's not an accident. We select 10 Main Street, we get there and it's a business. This is now a foreign element. It's also, if we look at the fourth bullet here, it's also a type of misclassification. Duplication, we might have an address that's listed two different ways, or we might have a businesses that has two different names. So in Canada, they have business numbers, but obviously they can also have business name. We may have businesses listed in two different ways by their number and their name, and this can cause us problems with duplication. Over coverage, if I'm looking at the city of Ottawa and I accidentally collect households from outside of it, that's considered over coverage. I have foreign elements. Now, how do we fix frame defects? So discarding them, we can use another frame. This is obviously not going to happen in most Statistics Canada surveys because our frames are very large. We can adjust it by updating and linking with other files, or we can use multiple frames. Sometimes we can use another frame to validate it. I used to say, and most people will say this, they'll say that it's impossible to have a perfect frame. And generally that's true. It's not always true. So for example, we have, 305 members of parliament, I think. I'm going to say 305. I hope that's right. We have 305 members of parliament. I'm going to say it. You can find a list on the government website of every single member of parliament and their email address and their mailing address. It's a perfect frame. It's not, there are none missing and there are none that shouldn't be there. It's a perfect frame. It's only got 300-ish people on it. As soon as we get into the bigger files, such as the household register, so the address register in Canada has 12 or 14 million dwellings on it. It's never going to be perfect. And in fact, we don't want it to be perfect. The cost of making this frame perfect is much too expensive. We would spend, you could never keep it up to date because of the number of houses that are being built, demolished, or split into several units. It's impossible, and you never really want a perfect frame. You want a frame that's good enough for what you're doing. And we do a lot of testing in Statistics Canada to see what's the effect of a 3% error rate, what's the effect of a 5% error rate, what's the effect of this subpopulation being excluded more likely than this subpopulation. So we do a lot of testing. Census of geostatistical units. So that's this idea of geographical boundaries. We have our business registers. So these are created from administrative sources such as payroll deduction and tax returns. The farm register, these are all the farms from the Census of Agriculture. We've now rolled this up into the business register because for us, farms are businesses. There's just a flag on the file that says, is this a farm, yes or no? So it's all maintained in the same place now at Statistics Canada. I'm going to sort of speed this up to get this done in the last 7 minutes. So the types of survey units we have to worry about, sampling units, units of analysis, units of reference, and respondent units. To me, this looks very confusing on the slide. I'm going to give some examples and hopefully to become clear. So our labor force survey, what do we sample? We're looking for, are people 15 years of age or older working, not working, or not in the labor force? So not attempting to find work. The sample unit is dwelling. We will select an entire dwelling, a household, and the unit of analysis is we'll do analysis based on people and households. Is there someone in this household working? Are all the people in the household working? So we can do it at two different levels. The unit of reference is every person in the household 15 years of age or older. We need to talk to we need information on every single one of them. The respondent unit is just one person though. Let's say there's two adults in their 50s and maybe an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old, and it's a nuclear family. Only one person needs to answer that. They can answer on behalf of the entire household. They don't have to pass the telephone around, or they don't have to each fill in their own questionnaire. We will just ask one person. For the longitudinal survey of immigrants to Canada, so the sampling unit, we have something called an immigration unit, and from there we'll select longitudinal persons. The analysis we'll do is at the person level, their household, and their family. We have obviously statistical definitions of all three of these. We'll have a longitudinal respondent, and we may have a respondent who's different for household income. So for example, if we happen to get a young adult, say 18 years old, they may not know how to answer the household income questions. So we'll have a second respondent who does hopefully know about household income to answer the survey. This gets us into the idea of proxy versus non-proxy answers. And this is something you have to determine for each of your surveys. Are you going to allow people to answer on behalf of other people? So if we have something like a health measure survey where we're measuring, say, blood pressure, obviously non-proxy will not work here. You have to measure the blood pressure of the selected respondent. I'm sure there's correlations, especially between married couples and their blood pressure, but we're not going to talk about that. And if it can be done by proxy, it means that someone can answer on behalf of someone else. Interviewers love proxy questionnaires because they means they don't have to speak to the specific person. Analysts, the head office people, analysts, methodologists, sometimes proxy answers are actually better than non-proxy. So for example, asking questions about children, you don't want the children answering the questions. So for example, when was the child last immunized? It's quite unlikely, it's very possible child can't answer if you're talking about a 3-year-old. So we need proxy answers in those cases. Sample size, we need to worry about the level of precision that we need. We need to worry about variability between units, budget, time, anticipated non-response, and population size. So the example I give here is if we're trying to look for total household income, if we go, and let's say we're looking for the city of Ottawa again, city of Ottawa has low income neighborhoods and higher income neighborhoods. You don't have to ask many people in a lower income neighborhood what their household income is before you can sort of start to get a measure of what the average household income is in that neighborhood. Whereas for us in a richer neighborhood, there's so much variability between units that you almost would need to conduct a census to get a good idea of what the household income is in a richer neighborhood. I think the other ones here might be fairly straightforward. I think we might come across this in another presentation anyways. Now, types of sampling methods, there's non-probability sampling and there's probability sampling. So probability sampling has this idea of randomization, and every unit has a calculable probability of being selected. You need, I can only think of examples where you need frames for these. You need a frame and you need to know that this person represents something and this is how they're being selected. On the non-probability sampling side, we have something called haphazard sampling. So that's someone walking around with a clipboard and asking questions. They have no idea what the population is. The example I like to give here is when we talk about if there's a particular store in a shopping mall and they want to know if people have been to the store or not, they can send kids, they can send adults out with clipboards to ask them, do you shop at this store, yes or no? And they can get an idea of the people in the shopping mall if they're going to that store or not, but they won't know what the entire population is. Volunteers, when you ask for people, like especially for medical research, judgment sampling is I will go out and I will find someone who I think can best answer this. And judgment sampling is usually very small samples. So I will use a judgment. I will go out if I'm doing the news. I'll find an expert on the Canadian economy if I'm doing a survey, if I want to do a story about how the economy is doing. If I want to know how the population feels about the economy, I will go out on the street and I will just ask people at random, haphazardly, how do you feel about the Canadian economy? On the probability side, we have simple random sampling, systematic random, proportional size, multi-phase, multi-stage. Each of these methods I'm going to talk about in presentations in the coming weeks. So hopefully you'll join us for that. So I'll leave that there for now. Non-probability sampling, it's fast, it's low cost, you can bang it out. I often say to my students, everyone in Statistics Canada has a job because we use probability sampling. It's so much more effort to do probability sampling than it is just to send people out with clipboards to ask whoever they want. So it's much more expensive. It takes a lot more time, but at least what we can do is we can say this is representative of the population. Instead of saying of our respondents, 32% said X, we can say of the Canadian population, of the residents of the city of Ottawa, of whatever it is that we're trying to measure, using probability sampling, we can then project this onto the entire population using weighting, which is another presentation that I'm going to give in the future.
Sorry, one person maybe quickly just asking, is one method more reliable or accurate? And I know we have, we're running to the end of our session. Hopefully people can stay just a few extra minutes so we can wrap up this presentation and do the evaluation. Thank you.
I would say on the non-probability sampling side, I would say they all have drawbacks, and it's usually what drives which one is being used is based on what's available to the person doing it. So it tends to be more about what resources do you have available to you, and you'll use non-probability sampling. On the probability sampling side, I guarantee we'll talk about that in the weeks to come. So I think this is my last, so I have 53 slides. The rest are just goodbye slides. The desirable feature of our sample, it should be possible to project the sample results onto the population. So we want to be able to project onto the population. The precision of the estimates based on the sample should be measurable. I have to be able to tell people using my data how accurate it is. I can't avoid that. It's something that I need to publish in Canada, how accurate my results are. And the last one just says, don't be wasteful. So the precision associated with the estimate should be as great as possible between cost, time, and operational considerations. Don't be wasteful with the budget you've been given. So I'm going to skip questions only for a couple minutes because Tracy has a form that she needs to fill in. And here's our long email address if you want to contact us. I have no problem sticking around for a little while if people have questions that they want to ask me. Otherwise, Tracy has an anonymous form she wants you to fill in. I'm sorry I had to rush there a bit at the end. This was sort of the longest of the presentations that I give over the course of this. So thank you very much.